Welcome to Longer Laterals. I'm Anne Bradbury, the CEO of the American Exploration and Production Council, and this is where America's energy story meets Washington. Every day, America's oil and natural gas producers are out in the field, drilling smarter, going farther, and delivering the energy that fuels our economy and strengthens our national security. It's a side of the industry that's dynamic, and it's foundational to how energy gets made in America. This podcast is about diving into that world. We're talking tech, policy, production, and pressure points. Everything that shapes how American energy actually works, and in-depth conversations with the people who live it every day. We're kicking off our first episode with one of the most respected leaders in the business, Travis Stice, Executive Chairman of Diamondback Energy and our chairman at AXPC. Travis brings 40 years of industry experience in oil and natural gas, starting with Mobil Oil back in 1985. He's held leadership positions at Burlington Resources, ConocoPhillips, Laredo Petroleum, and Apache before joining Diamondback in 2012, where he served as CEO for more than a decade. Under Travis's leadership, Diamondback went from a small Permian producer to one of the largest oil producers in the country today. He's a petroleum engineer by training and someone who's been foundational in turning the Permian into what it is today, an absolute powerhouse of American energy production. Today, Travis and I are talking about the evolution of the industry, what longer laterals really means, and policy decisions that shape operations in the field and where we go from here. So with that, let's dive right in. Travis, thank you so much for being here with us today. You have had a front row seat to one of the most transformational periods in American energy and arguably in American history. So let's start there. What has changed most about this industry since you started in the business? What feels fundamentally different about how we produce energy today?
Well, the first half of my career was dominated by an effort to explore and find new assets, new hydrocarbon assets. And then once they were found, we pivoted over to exploiting those assets that we just found. Over the back half of my career, it's been much more about already knowing where assets are in the unconventional sense and just shifting immediately into exploiting those. So we no longer had to explore for these assets. And we actually have changed the way we think about producing energy as well too. We have to now look at the whole energy equation, which first part of my career we didn't consider wind or solar as part of the energy equation, and today it obviously is. And then even more importantly, I think the ability to put our product on the global stage really happened in earnest in 2015 when we lifted the ban on exports. And then the last thing is the amount of technology that we're using in today's world is substantially different than it was when I first started my career. I'm sure in the early days of my career we were using the best technology we had available, but today it's just light years different than what it was when I first started my career.
Absolutely. So we talk about this period often as the American Energy Revolution, and with good reason. Before the Shale Revolution, the U.S. was very dependent on exports from foreign nations. Much of our domestic resource base was considered economically infeasible, out of reach. Then came horizontal drilling, which involved longer laterals, and completions innovation, or fracking. And today, America is the global energy leader. From your perspective, can you talk a little bit about what has defined this revolution?
Yeah, I think there's many aspects of defining a revolution, particularly as it pertains to energy. But I want to look through the aperture of just the Permian Basin by going back a few decades to give you an idea of the significance of the growth out of the Permian. The Permian Basin peaked in production in 1972 at a little over 2 million barrels of oil a day. And then for the next 38 or 40 years, we declined in production year over year, which means we failed to replace the production that we produced each year. And so it's just a natural decline for those almost 4 decades. And then the Shale Revolution started, and that's when we adopted horizontal drilling and horizontal fracturing techniques. And so from a low of about 800,000 barrels a day in roughly 2010, over the next 15 years, we grew production in the Permian to where we are today at over 6 million barrels of oil of production today. Now, to put that in perspective on the global stage, if the Permian Basin was a country all of its own, we would be the third largest producer of oil in the world. So that's a pretty significant change in just a really short period of time. So for me, looking through that Permian Basin aperture, that's how I define revolution.
Those are remarkable statistics, like really incredible, and so much to be proud of from the Permian. Let's dig into one piece of that innovation that brought about this revolution, longer laterals. So it's the name of the podcast, and it's a huge part of the modern shale story. So in combination with fracking, longer laterals has really been key to this American energy success story. Can you walk us through a little bit about what that means and how that's changed the way we develop resources in this country?
Yeah, once again, I think it's important to recognize where we were in early development in order to really get a better perspective of where we are today. When we first started exploiting unconventional resources, they were all we were all drilling as an industry vertical wells. And so out here in the Permian Basin, we were drilling to around 13,000 feet vertically, so just straight down. But then as we started embracing horizontal drilling and drilling sideways, we essentially drilled the same vertical hole down to about 13,000 feet, but we turned sideways. And the early wells, like Diamondback drilled, were only around 4,000 feet of lateral extension. But today, Diamondback, along with the rest of the industry, is drilling laterals now that are out over 4 miles long. It's just a remarkable advancement in technology. And to put that in perspective, a vertical well would produce typically around 200 to 300,000 barrels of oil, but it would take 50 years to recover that amount of oil. With these modern horizontal wells, we're recovering that amount of oil in the first 180 days. So it's just really hard to wrap your head around the significance of this horizontal development in the Permian Basin, but it is what drove that production that I talked about previously from 800,000 barrels a day to over 6 million barrels a day. And I think for, politicians and regulators to think about, we also substantially lowered the break-even price for crude with these horizontal wells.
That's, I mean, 4 miles underground is just absolutely remarkable. And it's also about producing more with less surface footprint, and less, surface disturbance overall, which has been a great benefit as well. I would love to hear from you about other technologies or practices that are driving efficiencies and performance in upstream right now.
Well, it's really important for the Permian Basin for a couple of reasons. This emerging technology. One is the fact that even with the best exploitation techniques that we have today, we're probably leaving somewhere between 80 and 85% of the oil in ground. So when we talk about enhanced oil recovery, that's a pretty significant prize that's out there if we can crack that nut. And I believe that in terms of investment dollars in enhanced oil recovery over the next 5 years, I think that'll probably exceed all of the investment dollars that were spent over the last 95 years since oil was first discovered out here in the Permian. So enhanced oil recovery is still a big future prize for us to solve. The second thing that we're seeing now take a role in the oil field is the emergence of artificial intelligence. And we're seeing it not only drill better wells, but it's also being able to complete better wells with the massive ability to analyze all this data that we collect. For the last several years, we've been actually collecting more data than we knew how to analyze as an industry, and now we're seeing the advent of artificial intelligence coming in and helping us manipulate that data in a way that allows us to recover more at a lower cost. And again, when you recover more at a lower cost, that lowers the break-even price for these investments.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and something that I've seen as well is actually, what a high tech industry this really is. And, I'm sure that's, not always been that way, but today So many of our companies are really driven by technology and really cutting edge technologies, which I think is really cool to see. So oil and gas is a notoriously boom and bust industry. You've seen a lot of highs, you've seen a lot of lows. I know that particularly in Midland, where you live and are headquartered, those effects are probably amplified even more given that, town's dependence on oil and natural gas as an industry. What do you think the public or policymakers misunderstand about the people and companies and communities behind American energy production?
Well, you just raised one interesting point that I think is failed to be recognized by most external to our industry, and that is the amount of technology that we apply per barrel or per MCF of gas that we produce. It's really significant, and it has been expanding exponentially over the last decade as we've continued to drive production growth. But I also think that it's not well understood that we're really a manufacturing process. And what I mean by that is we're manufacturing oil, we're manufacturing natural gas, and we do so in a ways that is very innovative and very technically driven, but yet we don't control the price of the product we produce. So if you think about Apple making an iPhone, all of the technical advancements that Apple wants to push out in each new version of the iPhone, they expect an economic return on that, and they get that economic return by setting the price of an iPhone. Well, we in the oil business, we still have to invest in technology. We still have to invest in other ways to improve, but we don't, excuse me, but we don't have the ability to set the price of the product we produce. So think about a manufacturing process that drives these outcomes without any certainty of an economic return. And when you don't have a certainty of economic return, that embeds a certain economic risk in capital allocation decisions, which what we have to deal with on an everyday basis.
Yeah. So, the oil and gas industry is really price takers, not price setters at the end of the day. And those prices are set on a global marketplace, not even domestically. So that's something that, is certainly a challenge. So you've certainly been one of the most active players in the Permian for decades now, and you have navigated federal permitting, shifting regulations, shifting political and policy landscapes. How have those dynamics impacted your sort of long-term view of investing, of capital allocation? And I'm particularly thinking about today, Washington is considering permit reform changes. And, what do you think is important and necessary to make those processes more workable and more aligned with industry and with our country's needs?
Yeah, look, Ann, we have to get back as a country to building things. There's been some cumulative effect of prior decisions, whether they've been politically motivated, regulatory or environmentally motivated, or sometimes even socially motivated. The cumulative effect of all of these decisions that have been made as a country has really impeded our ability to get things built. And whether we're trying to compete globally, for the artificial intelligence boom that's underway, or we're just trying to build more infrastructure, like to electrify the oil field, we need, more overhead lines. And we need to have all of our decision makers look at themselves and make a sober assessment of what are the impediments to getting things built. And then once you identify what those impediments are, you have to have the courage to make changes, because we cannot continue as a country to impede our manufacturing prowess by the lack of the ability to get things built in this country. So it's very, very important, and I'm proud of the role that AXPC and other organizations are playing to try to get at least permit reform done in the upcoming months.
Can certainly echo that sentiment. Thanks for that, Travis. So I'm going to wrap up with one question that we plan to ask every guest. What is one thing about your job or the oil and gas industry as a whole that would surprise most people in Washington?
I talked earlier about this manufacturing process that we have, particularly in the Permian Basin, but really throughout our industry, about manufacturing barrels of oil and natural gas. I think it would surprise most that this manufacturing process is a 24-hour, 7-day a week, 365-day a year job. All conditions, internal and external, weather related, and it takes a tremendous amount of grit and determination from more than 6 million people to support this industry. And I think when you look at the community impact of this is really significant, but because a lot of these individuals live in communities that the sole source of income is from the energy sector. So this is the ability for all of these employees in our industry to really try to raise their standard of living for themselves and for their family and for their grandkids. But really, it's a great way to see in action each pursuing their own version of our American dream. So it's a wonderful industry, and it's one that many, many people have found a successful career in.
But that's really lovely. I would just, add to that, these jobs are also incredibly high paying jobs and support a vast amount of, geographic and demographic folks all across America. And, that's something I think that we are certainly very proud of. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Travis. This has been an incredible conversation, a great way to kick off our new AXPC podcast, Longer Laterals, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Anne. It's been a wonderful time spending with you today.
Thanks to all of our listeners for joining us. Please subscribe and stay tuned for more episodes with America's energy leaders. Thanks so much.